welcome to another episode of the Animal Rights Show. So as you're joining us, you know the drill. If you've been with us before, let us know you're here in the comments and we will gladly say hello to you. We've got an interesting topic this week, I think, that will be difficult to fully address in an hour, but we're going to do our best, is the role of critique within the movement. I think all of us have had personal experiences with it, but I think as a movement, it's safe to say that it plays an essential role in evolving. So there's several different angles we're going to look at it through today, but maybe we just... I saw Bernie here in the comments, so we are going to give it a moment as people join us. But yeah, what do we think about critique? Has anybody gotten or received feedback? I know I have.
I think we all have.
It's never happened to me.
That's because you just... the question is, do you listen to it or not? Well, that's it. Like being on with the Animal Rights Show, I mean, our key aim being a rights-based approach, I know speaking for myself at least, there was a point where I was more welfare focused without knowing it, especially through my language. And I had to really take a step back and try to assess whether or not that was actually an effective way to go about things. And to do that, I had to open myself up to feedback. And it's difficult on both sides, isn't it? Both the delivery and the receiving of feedback. I know we shared around a short clip that talked about kind of keys to giving feedback, which maybe I think that might be a good way to kind of frame the conversation, but really just had a four-step process, which was kind of a micro yes, basically saying, can we talk about this situation, and getting the person to like almost kind of prepare them for the discussion. Step two is, kind of that specific observation of what happened, and being really direct and not too much fluff around that. And then the three is the effect of what happened. So for instance, let's say at an outreach event, someone was overly abrasive with the public and that made other volunteers feel uncomfortable, maybe to the point where they won't come to future events. That could be like the effect of the said action. And then the fourth point is to just kind of work on buy-in together and really trying to get some commitment on both sides to try to figure it out, saying, well, I think, perhaps it's being less aggressive with the public, for instance, could be a specific suggestion, and then say, what do you think about that, and try to start the dialogue that way. But it's I'm not trying to frame this as a difficult thing, and especially I think social media, maybe we can talk about, is an especially challenging place, I think, to get just honest dialogue going. Because we were talking just before we went live here, I think people's intentions are usually good. We're all in it for the same reason. We want to advance the plight of other animals, but it doesn't always necessarily get interpreted that way.
The thing with critique is that it's often omitted or ignored in an effort to avoid discomfort. But I think it is a necessary step if we want to evolve as a movement and as persons.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think without feedback and critique, we can't, like you just said, we can't grow and evolve individually or as a movement. And I think it will probably come down to not whether we give feedback or critique, but how we do it, and also maybe looking at why we're doing it. What is our intention and aim behind doing it? Are we in that moment, are we just trying to be right? Because sometimes, and I know especially when we go on social media, we see something that really enrages you and you're just filled with this anger and this need to kind of voice what you think. But often that is just in a way wanting to be seen as right, or to prove your point, where I think sometimes we have to think we have to get it right rather than be right. Like, how do we get this right for the movement and for the cause?
Yeah, because it's hugely about how we say something, isn't it? Because I think unless we get that right, it doesn't really matter what we're saying. And I think it's a very similar technique actually to advocating for veganism with non-vegans. We have to think about how our message is being received, not just saying whatever we want. And they're both important. When I think it's the same with critique. Even if we have a valid criticism, if we do it in a way, we were talking about shame a bit before we got on went live. I mean, I think that's... I don't know. I don't know if any of us think that shame's an effective tool or if it should be swerved. But I guess maybe it depends how we frame shame in the first place.
It's complicated because we have an interpretation thing going on then, don't we? Because critique and shame, as you said, we were kind of, as we geared up for this, we would, well, what would be the defining difference between those, and is it just a question of what one person would interpret somebody else as doing, whereas the person doing it doesn't see it that way at all? I mean, an example I've seen recently is, and I've done this, I think I mentioned that on the last show, I kind of put things like polite request, please don't call other animals it. And I thought, well, that's quite diplomatic and polite. I've actually put polite requests and stuff, and it still can get a real angry reaction. Oh, you're the vegan police, and even swear words, F off and all this kind of stuff. And then I saw somebody else about 4 days ago. They kind of go, oh, I'm doing this all the time, and it's really hard, isn't it? And they kind of started off with this kind of preamble of kind of, I do this all the time. It's so easy to do, and it's, you can just forget yourself when you write a sentence. But, can we please think about not calling other animals it? And that seemed to get overwhelmingly positive response. I just wonder whether it was that preamble that did it. That kind of almost like, I do this all the time, folks, but I'm just wondering whether,
That sounds like sorry, Roger. I was just going to say that's a kind of humble way of addressing a problem, isn't it? Admitting to, like, I've made this mistake before. So I kind of share in this problem in that way.
Yeah, I think it's... Sorry, Roger.
No, go
Well,
ahead.
no.
We're never going to say everything. We're all too polite.
No, I was just going to add to what Tom was saying. I think it's important to start on a positive. So I think, like that 4 points, the 4 steps you gave at the beginning there, Jeremy, that starts with almost asking the person for permission. Do you have my permission to just to give you feedback? But if it's not that, then it should be something positive, like finding common ground. Like, oh yeah, you know what? I used to do this exact thing, and then now I try this. What do you think about this? Because that invites someone to, like, come into my world. I empathize with you. I know how this is. I've been there. Now I do it this way. What do you think about that? You're also asking for their opinion. You're not just kind of going in there and going, you should be doing this. This is what I think, and you're wrong, kind of thing. I think it's just framing it a little bit differently.
Real quickly, hello to Bernie, Deb, Kristen, my mom, Jennifer, Tone, Digital Bloodbath, UK Vegan Family. Actually, I think, Wendy, you've just created a nice segue to our language highlight for the week. It's time for the language liberation of the week. Which is the whole we versus you framing. I think this is something I first came across when I was looking at effective outreach techniques, is instead of saying, you should stop supporting animal use, saying phrases more like, we've been grown up in a culture where we've been taught not to respect other animals, and, we have to think for ourselves how, we want to answer these moral questions and make it more of a collective. Because I do think, using the liberation language, it liberates us from that, like, us versus them mentality. Because, I think if we're honest with ourselves, I don't know what the average is, but I suspect if we were to focus in on street outreach specifically, people probably have been vegan like an average of like a year. So to, like, frame it as like, we're vegans and you're non-vegans, and having this, like, push-pull versus like actually, what do you think about this stuff? But I think the other point you hit on, which I think is part of this, Wendy, is the whole I statements. I know it's really hard, and we're used to using this language. However, I know I've tried to move more towards saying, she, he, they for other animals, and start the dialogue that way.
I feel that when we want, with a post or a statement, condemn a behavior, we is very useful, because it sounds completely different, and the other part doesn't go defensive. So you manage to do two things. You are actually condemning a behavior without insulting other people, even if you yourself you are not doing that. You are not eating animals, for example. Saying we makes a difference.
And that's actually. Sorry, you go.
Sorry, no, you go, Tom.
I was just going to say that that's something that Claire Mann, the vegan psychologist, talks a lot about. And I know Wendy recently interviewed her on a podcast, Thrive Vegan World. But yeah, she talks about that a lot when you're speaking to non-vegans, and she's got like an app which you can download, which is free to use, and she's got different scenarios where she outlines how to gives examples of how to communicate with non-vegans about more difficult issues. But the framing using "we" is a common pattern in how she recommends we speak when it comes to these problems.
Yeah, it's a really strong point. And what I was just going to say is it ties into the whole difference between shame and guilt, and that what Nella was saying about if you can critique the behavior and the action rather than the person, then you come more into the guilt area, which actually the difference between shame and guilt. Shame is saying that you are bad, that you are a mistake, rather than you did something bad and you made a mistake, because shame is very much personal, whereas guilt is about a behavior. And research shows that that shame actually is very highly correlated with things like addiction and depression and suicide, violence, bullying, eating disorders, all that kind of stuff. But whereas guilt is actually inversely correlated with all of those things, because it's actually very adaptive, because we can look at the things that we're doing that don't relate to how we want to be in the world, and it's therefore an adaptive. We can adapt our behavior. So guilt and shame are actually very, very different. So the we and the you kind of get us into those different areas, I think. We for guilt and you for shaming, perhaps.
And really focusing on the actions, isn't it, versus the individuals, like the sin, not the sinner, so to speak, I guess, which is a tricky thing to do. I mean, I think another thing that often comes up in these conversations is the whole call in versus call out perspective. And I think if we get someone who's not open to feedback, it's going to be challenging regardless. But if we can create a private line of communication, it's much more likely to say, oh yeah, actually, I didn't really think about it that way. And perhaps try to find a solution together, versus in a public setting. I think it's much more likely to go on the defensive, but it's not always easy. Like, a lot of people aren't accessible in private.
And furthermore, sometimes it's not feasible. For example, if you have, 50 persons at Facebook thread commenting and using it for other animals, you could not possibly send 50 personal messages. And you want your comment to be there so other people can read it.
It's efficiency, isn't it? Yeah, because it can be challenging. The thing I try to do with social media is really try to focus on those conversations where I do feel like people are open to discussing alternatives, because some people will just shut down fairly soon on, and I'm by no means perfect, but I'm starting to notice more of the signs for that maybe they're not actually interested in a dialogue. And this is internal within the movement or non-vegans, regardless. I think really focusing our energy, because we've got our work cut out for us. We've got plenty to do, so there's no reason, I think, to spend excess energy where it's not necessarily going to yield any reward.
Yeah, bearing in mind who are we giving feedback to? So, like, looking at all those questions, actually, who are we giving it to? Is it worth our time? Why are we doing it? Are we coming from a place of integrity rather than superiority? Where and when and how? If we ask ourselves those questions and try to come from a place of, sort of integrity and empathy, open and fluid thinking rather than rigid thinking and all those kind of things.
That's the issue of the person, transmitting. But then there's also the issue of the person receiving. So it's a kind of two-way street, and that's where the shame issue comes in, I think. I mean, a little bit kind of sociologically speaking, as it were, we would think in terms of reflexivity, whereas that's usually like self-reflection. So it's that thing that Jeremy mentioned that. And Wendy was saying, you get all steamed up and you think, I'm going to say something, and then it'll be a question of thinking twice and just giving yourself a minute just to kind of try and work out in your mind, what's really going on, and do you want to do it, and what would be the consequences of it. And then you've got this other issue called recipient design, which is really just basic communication between social animals. And we, part of our job as social movement participants, if we're in the education business, as it were, and most of us are, means then that we've also got a duty, really. You can't get around it. You've got to then think about the person who's going to receive your message. It's one thing, as it were, just to speak your truth, so to speak. But, you know, if that's going to put the other person's back up and shut them down, what's the point? You know, I mean, that is a responsibility that we've got to take on. And it surprises me sometimes that there seems to be some suggestion in the movement that only a few people are any good at this. You know, I mean, you know, the usual, you know, earthling head, oh, you keep so calm and, you know, this kind of stuff. I would have lost my temper and this kind of stuff. And you think, well, why? You know, you're in a conversation. So what's the point of losing your temper? I mean, isn't that just basic? And of course, obviously, you know, the issues can be quite emotional, and you know about the rights violations and all the rest of it. But even so, just on a tactical level, what's the point of being, you know, confrontational, losing your temper? So you just got to think about the other person, as we do always in social interaction. We're social animals. We just do it automatically. So we're not going to be outside of that. Once we become an advocate, if anything, we've got to be more careful about how we talk to other people, and that includes each other.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Roger, as well. Everything you just said really makes a lot of sense. And another thing I think that is a skill that we need to practice more and more, and something that we seem to have lost in society generally, not just in the movement, but in society generally, is the skill of listening. Because I think often we're so caught up on wanting to talk and say the things that we want to say and express our opinion, that we are closed off to what the other person is saying. And we have to remember that although we see the world through our filters and our eyes, we project out from our own experiences, that other person is not in our world. So it's trying to almost, again, it's going back to empathy and getting into their world. How are they seeing the world? Can I get myself into their world and then bring them a little bit into mine, and try to, and by doing that, you have to listen, and you have to listen. And I don't just mean you have to stop and shut up and pretend you're listening and think, oh, I'll be able to get a word in a minute. It's actually really practicing the skill of active listening, I think, which is really important for that.
Yeah,
And
paraphrasing
also-
is a great way. Yeah, just repeating back what you just heard is simple, but a really good way to show you're listening.
And we're also must try to really listen to what the other person is saying, and not assuming what they are going to say, which is something that happens very often.
Yeah, almost like reading from a script, doesn't it? Because it seems like Deb's had success with the we to help frame the conversation. And I like what Jennifer said here around teaching versus preaching, because I do think that is something we often, because I think as animal advocates, we obviously are advocating because we feel strongly about our position. However, to not dismiss the, you know, to your point, Wendy, other people's realities, because that is their reality, and just telling them ours without listening to theirs isn't likely to end, you know, very good
Going
things.
back to what we
Well,
were saying.
most importantly, did you see Tone's message, Roger? You've got to.
Yes, I know. I was going to come on to that, but going back to going back to Jennifer's point, that's interesting because you know, Jennifer does street outreach in Dublin, and one of the techniques that she uses is by saying, well, you know, I haven't been vegan that long, so I know where you're coming from. I felt like that not that long ago, but I've changed and stuff. And that really has a really positive effect, because you're not doing the old, you know, I'm much better than you, I you know, anything like that. And so again, it's a very kind of it's an effective I mean, I'm not even sure if you should call it a technique, but it's a very effective communication, and it's in a way fairly obvious. It's a little bit like it's obvious to say we rather than you, isn't it? I mean, like, it shouldn't have taken us, you know, you shouldn't have to go on the street too many times or have too many conversations, debates on social media before you kind of suss that out, really. But maybe we just need to consider that a little bit more. But going to Tone, yes, it's not really splashing out in the sense that it's a couple of it's a couple of bits of cloth that I got from Bernie Wright of Alliance for Animal Rights this afternoon, and I think one of them at least was used for a cat basket. I think. I had to well, it wouldn't have been a cat basket. It would have been a dog basket with Bernie, but I had to de-hair it. Put it that way. It's going to go straight in the washing machine as soon as we're off.
Oh, leave it. It's not everything. Things are nice when they smell of dogs. I'd leave it. I'd leave the hairs on it.
Yeah, Ruger will love that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course. That's true.
Well, and I think, I mean, our what we've got planned for today all kind of ties into the same topic. So I think that leads us into the objection of the week, which I'll put my hands up. I'm a bit nervous about this week because I am taking part, but we're basically going in, rather than framing this from a vegan, non-vegan perspective, it's going to be more from an internal movement perspective. And let's see, who do we have here? I think Wendy and I are both going to have a go at responding to Nell about a common movement issue. So we'll let you decide afterwards which one you think is more effective.
Are you going to try and shame each other? Is that what you're going to do?
What this is not our normal behavior. Just so we're clear, though. So we'll tee it up that way, so there's not any missed expectations.
I'll let you know later, folks, if it really is. Okay.
The behind-the-scenes knowledge. It's time for the objection of the week.
You intersectionals are ruining this movement.
We're not ruining the movement. You're ruining the movement.
No, it's called the animal rights movement. It means
Yeah,
it's about non-human animals.
And animal rights is an extension of human rights. You're an animal, right?
Of course, biologically I'm an animal, but socially there is a huge difference, and animals need their own movement.
The animals have their own movement.
Yes, one movement that you are trying to change into something else.
You're trying to change it. We're not trying to change it.
I mean, I'm asking for animal liberation, and the whole message of the animal liberation is lost within the collective liberation claim.
You don't think we should collect?
I think human rights are important, but there are different places and spaces for that.
So you don't want to talk about human rights?
Oh, yes, of course I want to, but not within animal rights organizations and activist groups. There are other organizations and spaces for that. And you can participate in as many as you want, but you can't mix everything.
So you're anti-human?
No, I'm not.
You're just anti-human, aren't you?
I'm not anti-human. I believe in human rights, but I believe in animal rights too. And when you mix everything, you are deserving other animals.
You're just a silly, closed-minded Republican.
Sorry. So, you intersectionals are running this movement.
Okay, so you think that that we're ruining the movement. Could you tell me more about that? What is it exactly that you think is ruining the movement? Could you explain that a little bit more for me?
Of course. This is the animal rights movement, meaning it's about non-human animals, and you're trying to bring everything into it: sexism, racism, everything.
So, do I hear right in that you're saying that basically when we are perhaps more what you might describe as intersectional, that we're sidelining the other animals? Would that be correct?
Exactly. Other animals need their own movement.
Okay, so first, I'd love to say that I really agree with you that the other animals should be the focus and be totally centered in the animal rights and the vegan movement. I really agree with that. But what is it exactly that you think is ruining the movement? Because I agree with you. We should focus the other animals. But do you feel that it is possible to focus on the other animals and still be respectful of the humans, either within the movement or who we're advocating to and in the world generally? Is that possible?
We should always be respectful to other humans. I'm not saying that we should condone discriminative behaviors. I'm just saying that there is a different space and time for human rights and a different one for animal rights. Animal rights organizations are about other animals.
But would you agree that those organizations are made up of humans?
Of course they are.
So would you agree that if an organization is made up of humans, that we need to be respectful to the humans who are in those organizations? So if we are, as vegans and animal rights advocates, if we are in a movement against oppression, should we not really be consistent in our stance against all oppression, whether that be against, the gender, sexuality, color, race, physical abilities, or whatever it might be? Do you not think we should be consistent to those around us in our anti-oppression?
We should, but I can I can choose my own battles, and I want to fight for other animals. I'm not disrespectful towards any other human, but I don't want to fight for human rights. I want to fight for animal rights. That's my priority. So when I'm advocating for other animals or doing an action for other animals, I don't want to address human issues at the same time. I think this is fair.
But if we want to have a movement that is powerful and empowered, do we not want the humans that are part of that movement to feel included? And if we are not consistent in our anti-oppression stance, then perhaps those humans won't feel included, because if we are not aware of being misogynistic, sexist, racist, or whatever at an event, then we are not being inclusive to those humans. So then, therefore, we're not an inclusive movement. And if we're trying to create a vegan world made up of humans, because veganism is about our human relationships with other than human animals, then how can we create a vegan world if we don't advocate for oppression across the board? And these things are very entangled and overlap. It's a very complex world. I'd love to have a world that simply says we can fight for this over here and this over here, but it's not. It's a lot more complex than that, and everything is interwoven and entangled. And I think to create a vegan world, we have to advocate against all oppression all the time.
This has been the Objection of the Week.
That explains a lot.
All right, what do we think? Who's the better feedback giver? That was awesome.
That was hard to say. I was just really wanted to giggle for your. You're just a silly Republican.
I have to say that we have tried to rehearse that, and Jeremy tried to be mean, and he really couldn't do it.
I made similar to Roger's notes with all the cruelty and language that he had written down. I had a note to myself: "You're not allowed to make any points." But yeah, I really try. I mean, I think it sounded like obviously two extremes, but I think we've probably seen Facebook threads that are simulate that. Yeah. If we were to actually read out the Facebook thread, that it wouldn't be too far off.
And I think that because I've seen some stuff online, probably a while back, where the way you responded, Jeremy, is similar how it's online. It's like you say this, you're trying to ruin this, and it's a dialogue and kind of constructive conversation that unfortunately never seems to develop from that.
Yeah, I was trying really hard to think of what name calling to use, but that's the best I could come up with.
Well, a very common claim is that intersectionals, which itself presumably is constructed as an insult, are seen as a cancer in the movement. It's very, very often that I see that claim, in comments and stuff.
Yeah, and I really liked, Wendy, how you were you didn't just launch into what you wanted to say. You said, actually, what are your concerns? And then identified where you shared the same concerns, and then you started to bridge that to kind of, okay, how do we establish next steps that are in alignment with both? Because I honestly think when we did the Zoom call around the relationship between human rights and other animal rights, it was pretty productive. I mean, there's a like some people, obviously people have strong feelings on the topic, but I think it's much more productive, I think, than a lot of the social media threads. And I think that's because we're not that far apart. I think when we actually talk about it, people aren't saying to, put down your sign for animal rights and put up this sign for human rights. It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, and I think actually part of it is what Roger just said. Actually, it's the name, the label, because actually what I wanted to say there, and I didn't get around to saying it, was that I don't really identify as and intersectional. I wouldn't call it that. I don't even know if the term, I really like the term for what I'm talking about. I just know that I have to be as consistently anti-oppression, as I was saying. That's not an identity of you're this label. It's like, it's a way of being. And I feel that it's a way of being, but that a lot of us share. But because that word gets in the way, it's like a label that you suddenly put onto someone and go, oh, you're in that box now. I don't agree with what's in your box. And it's like, well, you probably actually do, but you're just thinking of it in a slightly different, through different filters. Yeah.
Like Roger said, it's taken on a label, a stereotypical label, which that online in some circles, that it's just thrown around. Oh, there's damn intersectionals again, and then people get a simplified explanation of what it means, and then some people do look into it, some people don't, and it kind of perpetuates. But I like to think of kind of I understand, and I get the kind of meaning behind it being intersectional, and what you spoke about, Wendy, in your response of that it is. These things are interwoven. I think of these things in a similar way, that they're multi-dimensional. AFCO and Silco, in one of their books, they talk about how, like, when you look at sort of issues of justice, you're on like this terrain, and there's a lot of things going on, and you have to kind of like, you're sometimes you're getting pulled in different directions, and there is a learning in that, learning about different causes, learning about how to adapt our approaches, and it's a continual learning process, and there's discomfort in that initially sometimes. But that is okay, and that's something that we should embrace.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think it's great, though, that we've had a mother of a panelist having to say to that panelist that they should calm down.
I'm sure that's the first time my mom's ever told me to calm down. So
I love it.
Hopefully it didn't trick you too much with that one, Mom. Yeah, and actually, it looks like for your green screen, you've got some people thinking that you've gone against the lockdown. Here you are out in public, Roger, with no mask or anything.
I'm actually in Dublin city centre at the moment.
It's sunny where you are, isn't it? It's pitch black here.
Yeah.
And the very stationary people behind you.
Well, I said that we've got a show. Could they be respectful,
just hold the pose.
Yeah.
And also some comments about this. Just as far as the human rights thing, a subject that we've struggled with. I mean, I know one thing that I think Roger's coined, that I know I keep coming back to, and I think a lot of us do, is that whole focus versus scope thing. That it's not a matter of completely changing the focus. It's just a matter of allowing space in the scope for human rights. And I think Wendy hit strong on the making fellow activists feel safe and welcome and all this stuff, because they'll leave the movement if they don't, I think is the reality. I think also just from an outreach perspective, there's a lot of animal rights is built on the top of the concept of human rights, so it's only going to empower our outreach. And obviously there's a lot of nuances of how we go about that, but on the surface, I don't think there's necessarily anything we need to do any different specifically. I think we just need to be open to learning is step one for me. And I think that's what I see a lot from, to be dualistic, but, from the other side, that there's just that kind of resistance to learning or seeing how things could impact the movement. But yeah, let us know in the comments, because it's obviously a big topic.
Learning the history of the movement helps, because most people think that the intersectionality concept is a new thing. That this movement used to be only about other animals, and somehow intersectional made it about something else. If we read the history of the movement and realize that these were the original values of the movement, it's easier to see the whole focus on scope thing.
Yeah, and Deb's just talking about the idea of repeating back the person's opinion, which I thought you did really well, Wendy, in the role play, is saying, that I feel that way too. I want to, keep the focus on other animals and so forth. Because every person's different. I mean, if we go into these interactions, and same when we go talking to non-vegans, if we assume every non-vegan's the same, and I just need to say, rice, beans, and bananas are the cheapest foods on the planet, and, animal cruelty is bad, and then on to the next, I mean, we're not going to have very dynamic outreach or results, I don't think.
You know, there's one interesting nuance and complication here, because the people who are anti-intersectional, and I agree with Tom, you know, that word is now an insult, and it's very similar to carnist, you know, so a lot of people throw carnist around because I think it's got that kind of snarl to it, you know, you're a carnist kind of thing. But I think the people who are anti-intersectional think that by embracing justice across the board and justice issues across the board within the movement is going to drive some people away, particularly maybe people with a right-leaning kind of bent to them. And so therefore the movement will be smaller. And the irony is that the people who talk about things like alliance politics, like Steve Best, he makes the same point, but from a different angle. He says that we're not big enough to do what we want to do on our own. So therefore, we've got to join together in alliances with other progressives. And at the moment, we are antithetical to other progressive movements because of the way we behave, the way we talk, and because of some of our values and some of the groups in them, and you know, the sexist stuff and the racist stuff and all the rest of it. And so it's almost like both sides in this particular instance are saying the same, but from a completely different angle, which is really interesting.
And I just get the image of, you know, when you're against kind of the whole, I don't even like using the term intersectional in it, when you're trying to broaden the scope of the movement, I just get the image of like trying to like really running to save someone, and those someone's being other animals, but you're just trampling on everyone else to get there. And it's like, well, how can we justify that? How can we, what is even logical about that?
The thing is, though, Wendy, Nella was right. It's not that we're trying to broaden the scope. It's that the scope was already there.
Yeah,
we're maintaining a broad scope, not trying to create. See, you get a lot of that thing. Oh, you're trying to hijack the movement. It's the other way around. You know, and then I mean,
Tone's got a comment to that point. Is that many don't know the history of the movement, because I know you've focused a lot of that in your work, haven't you, Roger? As far as talking about the history and also talking about the evolution of the movement too. So balancing the history with also kind of where we're going and what makes sense. Because I think even held up under a modern lens, I'm not sure how excluding human rights awareness is going to do us any favors.
No, at the same point, the point about evolution is really interesting in terms of what we've talked about throughout the show, really, because one thing that social movement theory sees about social movements is that they move. And one of the things that are most deleterious to social movements is if they stagnate. And so therefore they have to move and evolve all the time. And so that means that values within the movement will shift and alter and everything. And I don't have a problem with that. In fact, it's probably a good thing. It's probably something that has to. For example, our language, as we all know in this show, our language is altering all the time. And we wouldn't speak like the people who founded our movement because the language is different. In the same way as, I can think of the people who began sociology, and we wouldn't speak like they spoke in those days. People are a product of their time in that sense. So evolution is not a problem. And actually wanting to make an argument about change, that's also not a problem. It's more what's upsetting for me, I suppose, is when people are fairly new to the movement come in and speak to people who are even newer to the movement and say, well, veganism is this or animal rights is this. And they've got nothing to back that up apart from that's what they want it to be. And that seems to me unfair. And as people know, I've got this thing about fairness, and I just don't think it's fair to come into a movement and then try and reshape it to your own politics rather than learning about how the movement is in the first place. And if you want to change it, make the argument, but at least know what the movement is rather than just stating what it is because it's in your interest to do so. That's not right.
Well,
that doesn't upset you, does it, Roger?
Sorry?
That doesn't upset
he doesn't
you,
think
does
about it that much. doesn't
Easy.
bore him. Well, I think, I mean, we've hit on it a few times throughout this time together, but I think a huge thing is the framing. It's just establishing off the bat, you know, what is it we're actually talking about? I think so many online exchanges aren't actually doing that. They aren't actually framing, well, what do you envision as intersectionality, which I think we all agree that's not necessarily the best term. I'm not sure where racism intersects with speciesism, for instance, but there probably are some examples in the construction of animality and all that stuff that we could get into, but just on the surface, it's not that straightforward.
Can I briefly address Sharon's 2 points there?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the first one about alliance politics. Well, obviously, we would associate that idea with Steve Best, probably. And there's an anarchic idea which is a critique of alliance politics, which is almost like a development of it, in the sense that alliance politics envisions kind of a lot of groups coming together, and the people in those groups, if you like, stay in their own kind of box, but they will work with others at any given time. The more anarchic idea is to dissolve the barriers between the boxes, and then everyone becomes each other. So everybody becomes anti-racist, anti-feminist, anti-speciesist, rather than the idea that anti-racists would work with anti-speciesists. They kind of merge because ultimately their politics are really the same, because it's all justice-based, it's all anti-oppression and everything else. And I think there's a lot in that. But the interesting thing as well, either from that perspective or going back to Steve Best's perspective, he said it's very difficult, because you know it's actually quite difficult to speak to other progressive social movements quite often because they're speciesist. But they find it difficult to speak to us because a lot of what we do at least looks from the outside racist and sexist. And you know, if people are attuned, for example, to ableist language, what are they going to do? They're going to look at our movement and think, I'm not going there. I mean, you know, you can't turn YouTube on or anything without hearing ableist language all the time, over and over and over and over again.
And to be specific, we're talking about crazy, insane, and even, you know, idiot, stupid, dumb, all those things. Anything to do with someone's cognitive ability.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of famous YouTubers I could think of, I'm not going to mention them, who kind of like to drop the R-bomb all the time, you know. And
I saw it just yesterday, and what I would think to be a progressive thread.
That's right. Yeah, I remember you telling me that, and you're thinking, whoa, you know, it's because, you know, it's kind of, well, all right, they're just being real and all that, but that's not the way it works. We're in a social movement. We've got some responsibilities here. You know, you're not a free agent in a sense. We're constrained by what we want to do. In the same way as think about the way a political party is. There's a kind of party line, if you like. And whether we like that idea or not, and you think, oh, you know, we don't want to go there. We are there, really, because we're in a social movement.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think the initial reaction, I think, is, you know, when people say the focus isn't on humans, it's like to learn about this stuff is only going to benefit us, because there are, like, you know, obvious intersections between ableism and speciesism. You know, even just expressions like blind as a bat. You know, it's and we can talk about these as subtle language points, but they're everywhere, and being aware of them is just going to make us better advocates. You know, and to close ourselves off to that feedback, because I think that's a challenging thing with feedback. We don't want to take everything we're here on board, but if we close ourselves off to, you know, those intersectionals or, you know, that type of framing, you know, we're not going to evolve.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it giving a really confusing message as well if we're telling people, right, okay, we really want you to stop oppressing the other animals, like it's so important, you have to stop oppressing, but fill your boots with everyone else, like we don't care, like be ableist, be sexist, right, like we don't give two whatevers about that. Isn't that a completely confused and confusing message? And I think and if you kind of follow kind of universal energy, quantum physics, or anything like that, and if you believe in anything like that, then we only ever get what we want back when we're very clear in what we actually want. Because if our messages are confused, we get that confusion. We are trapped like for like, so we have to be clear and give a clear, consistent message of what we want.
Hey, Wendy, 2 whatevers. What did you really want to say?
Oh no, I really
Speaking in code.
got Adele at Glastonbury. I just went
Well, and Dev's got a good point here around the main objection I've heard is that the animal rights will always be subsumed and eventually co-opted by human rights movements if we don't stay separate, and the other animals will be sent to the back of the line yet again. Maybe we spend a bit of time on that.
No evidence for that at all.
I think that Steve Best does talk about it in his speech, which I think is it called Total Liberation, the one that's on YouTube. He does say that it's very difficult, to speak to your point, that it takes some work, when you're building alliances with progressive movements. But that it's an important thing that needs to be done. But the point that he makes is that we're in the driving seat with other groups. Like, they're not going to lead us. We're there with them, level, and then we go together to prevent that from happening. Sort of the point that Deb makes. But again, I don't know enough about the history to say that that's actually happened, or you said that there hasn't. There's no evidence for that.
No, I don't think so. In the sense that it's this thing about, as Jeremy says, there's this kind of thing about there's some kind of hierarchy that's created, and other animals would be pushed down to the lower rungs and everything. But I'm not quite sure if that's even how justice and the fight against justice and the challenge against oppression works. I mean, it's just a kind of across the board kind of idea anyway. And if you the wider the sweep of your analysis seems to me to be the most inclusive, because ultimately you're talking about the same thing but with different examples, case studies.
Well, and I think it depends. Go ahead, Nella.
Oh, thank you. There is this argument that animals are always the oppressed and never the oppressor, whilst humans can be oppressed and oppressors at the same time. I don't find it convincing, though, because I like this idea of movements merging. It's like sending a message that let's all stand together against the powers of oppression, and then we become so much stronger and effective.
Yeah.
Well, and I'd be curious if people, are really hardline about this. It's only about other animals, or the animals, is what's often said. Is what do they say to the common objection that you vegans only care about other animals? Because it feeds right into that common non-vegan objection. Instead of saying the Watson thing that thinking that if we can build our respect for other animals, we'll find ways to build our respect for each other. And obviously there's a lot of ways you can go with that. But to me, it just strengthens the tools we have at our disposal when we're making a case for animal rights. I mean, I don't think anyone's actually proposing that we tear down all the campaign messaging that we've been using and replace it with completely new stuff. I think sometimes that's the way it's framed. But I mean, maybe if we just, we've obviously taken probably the most complicated example of internal movement feedback, because I think it's correct that I think as a movement we could do a better job talking about this subject, because regardless of where people fall, hopefully if we can, have better communication, we can wind up in a better place. What do we think as a group, just taking a step back and looking at feedback in general? Do we think that we have enough feedback? Do we have too much feedback, not enough? Or is perhaps the issue more how that feedback's being delivered? And I don't know, maybe as individuals, do you feel as individual advocates you get enough feedback from your fellow advocates?
I think I do, but most times I have to ask for it. I mean, there are a few persons that I go to when I need feedback, and since we decided on the topic of the week, I was trying to see what makes their feedback so valuable and effective. And it was language, tone, and the fact that come from a good place. Their critique comes from a good place. They're compassionate, they're empathetic, and they're really trying to see and understand all arguments before taking a position. And of course, they're trying to be fair. But sometimes I feel that we have to ask for it because other activists are hesitant to give feedback.
Yeah, that kind of push versus pull feedback, to actually pull and request, I think that's something I try to work better on myself, because I think we thrive on feedback, because I think oftentimes what I've heard from people is stuff that I wouldn't have thought of myself. And it just gives us more of that 360-degree feedback.
Well, we've got some feedback in the comments from HS Ross. So if you pull up the last one there, first of all, I'm not in a managerial role here in that sense, and I think Wendy, they're referring to a comment you made about quantum physics, and
Yeah,
so
and I would say that's an example of feedback that's not very helpful, because what's the specific critique?
What's the critique?
You know, and is it coming from a good place? Maybe they can let us know in the comments, but it just seems like a bit of a
well, there are a
angry
couple
jab to me.
of other comments above that about being inaccurate about science or ignorant about science and this kind of stuff. So again, if that, you know,
Yeah, tell us more, HS Ross. Tell us more about why that. Why that
Maybe you
is
can demonstrate how to give constructive feedback, because I think you're failing at the moment.
Yeah, why what is it that that you didn't like about what I said? And yeah, tell me more. I'm open to I'm open to hearing and open to listening. And of course, anything that I say is my opinion, and it's just what I believe and about the quantum physics. And I did say, if you believe in that kind of thing, what we give out, we get back. But often that is that a lot of what I've read around quantum physics does tend to tie into that. So I'm not professing to be any expert in physics whatsoever.
I don't know if any of us can wear that hat today. What do the rest of us think? I mean, I'd probably say I could use more feedback. Would anybody else put themselves in that bucket? I mean, no, it sounds like you say you get enough. I mean, what do the other four of us think? I mean, I put myself in, I could use more of it.
I could use more of it as well. Yeah, it kind of annoys me when I don't get enough, because I think I appreciate different people's perspectives, and like you said, I think that feedback is like it's gonna sound corny, but it's a gift. Like you can choose to take it, choose to push it away if you want, but I think to be open to it and accepting it is important. Yeah, like you, Joe, I'm keen to get feedback.
What about you, Wendy and Roger? Too little, too much? Is it the right kind of feedback? Because I think the hard thing is, especially just a quick anecdote, is what I frame myself oftentimes in street outreach, maybe just because that's where I have the most fun, not necessarily where I spend the most time. When someone walks away from us, very rarely do we actually get feedback. I did a talk at a humanist group, and it was one of the coolest things, because afterwards they did a post on their group that I was now a part of saying, here's the points Jeremy raised. And I was able, for one of the first times, to get a detailed response to what I was trying to put across, and feedback about how that process went. And it's so rare, I think, for animal advocates. So I don't know if you two have had that experience.
I think I would sort of concur with what Nella and Tom said, in that maybe you don't always get enough, but then it's not always the people who are feeding back to you, or maybe you're advocating to, wouldn't be in a place to feedback. But I think also it's important to understand who to go to for feedback as well. Like if it's just a matter of you're in a social media thread and someone's giving you feedback just out of a negative place, or just because they feel like they want to prove a point or whatever, then are they the person that you're going to listen to? Because I think sometimes we can, we can sort of take on board, going into our own shame because maybe someone said something that they don't agree with, but maybe not done it in an effective way. So I think it's also bearing in mind, like, who are we going to trust to give us feedback and actually take it on board. So I think, like Nella was saying, she's got people who she would reach out to, and I think it's knowing who to turn to, who are the people who you trust, who are the people that you value their opinion. And sometimes it might be a matter of disregarding feedback in terms of, okay, they're not in my world, they're not doing what I'm doing, they're not trusted people for me. They're just out to prove a point, or they're just out to be negative or whatever, or just trying to be superior. Therefore, I'm not going to take that on board. Trust the people who are there with, like Nella was saying, with good integrity, who share your values and who have got your back, basically, and who want to see you thrive. So be mindful of who you're going to feedback for.
And also, if we ask for feedback several times from the same persons that we trust, it's easier for them to pick up the phone the next time and say, you did that or you said that, and I feel that I have to tell you something about it.
Yeah.
Then it's easier for them.
A bit more of an open dialogue that you're both kind of giving and receiving feedback, so it doesn't feel too one-sided that one person's just telling the other person off all the time. I think, Roger, you're the last one to share. Do you need us to tell you more about how good you are or how bad you are?
Well, I see it as a bit of an ongoing process. I mean, first of all, that's what social animals do to each other, but also that's kind of what just goes on as a natural thing in a way in social movements. I think one thing of late, which has been interesting for me to notice as a sociologist, is the fact that some of the kind of famous people in the movement now, they've had nothing or very, very little but very positive feedback. And that's the overwhelming thing that they get. And that is almost as bad as negative feedback, probably, in the sense that they kind of get a distorted view of their effectiveness. Because I think then there's a tendency for them to play to that kind of response. And that basically means that a lot of what they say goes down really well in the vegan movement, but it doesn't necessarily play too well outside of that. And so, we've talked about vegan bubbles already, but there is this thing where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that, the best messages that feed well in the vegan movement get repeated over and over again, and then the praise gets repeated. And that's not really feedback then. That's almost a little bit fawning in a way. And again, I think it's a complicated issue, but I think in general terms, there's a lot of feedback all the time. It's a question of just seeing it as that, I suppose. And
not taking it personally, yeah.
Yeah, there is that, because as we said before, what is critique for one person is being shamed for the receiver, even if it wasn't meant as that, and then the conversation would be framed about was that shaming rather than was that critique valid, those kind of arguments. And so we can really get lost in the kind of, I don't know, vortex of social media very quickly, I think. And I suppose in the days before the internet, everything was slower in that sense. It would be a question of writing a letter almost, and then getting 6 months later, it would be replied in the letters page of a magazine. And so it wasn't so immediate, which obviously is not good in one way. At the same time, it was very good allowing you to be very kind of reflexive about what you're thinking, because you certainly calmed down after all that time. And then you'll be thinking, well, okay, should I respond now? Yeah, so it's complicated.
That's a really strong point, actually, Roger, in that I think with social media, it is very immediate. And I think that's something to bear in mind, is when do you give feedback? Do you give it immediately in that moment of pure raw emotion, especially if that emotion is anger and you're immediately reacting? So I think often it's useful if we try to respond rather than react, so that reaction is in that raw emotion. Whereas if we can calm down and come from a more reasonable place and respond perhaps later on. So it might be that if you're feeling that anger, don't respond, like take yourself out of that situation. And because also we have to remember, when we're on things like social media or platforms like this, they're maybe not so much here, but more when it's text-based, I guess, that we don't have the body language, we don't have facial expression or micro expressions that we're so used to as humans reading, intonation, voice tone, and all of those things that are such a massive part of communication, because the words are usually a very small percentage of communication. Whereas when you're just writing a text on a media thread, it's everything. The words are everything. You don't have all the other things going with it. So it's even more important that we're mindful of what words we're choosing and how we're delivering those words, because we're losing all of that humanness around the communication as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think all of us just being open to feedback. And yeah, talking about, I think because Roger hit on a bit, kind of the influencers are kind of a bit immune to it maybe, because they are in those kind of positive feedbacks, and probably we all are to an extent, constantly kind of giving each other pats on the back versus actually taking a critical look at what we're doing and trying to find that balance. So
Yeah, and if you were fairly new to the movement and you started following some of these kind of more revered individuals like Earthling Ed, and you just saw them being praised for what they were doing, it's quite understandable how someone could think that what they were doing is the best way, the optimal way, which I think speaks to the point of broadening the amount of perspectives of people that we follow to kind of feed that critical thinking voice, which is that we all need to keep feeding or listening to.
And also, some people are hesitant to criticize the influencers. They are almost afraid to do so. I think this is one of the problems of this celebrity culture we have.
yeah, because all of a sudden all their followers pile on and say, no, they're the best and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden the point gets lost a bit, doesn't it? And instead of actually saying, how can we improve as advocates, shouldn't we all be asking that question, both within ourselves and to others? So,
well, critique, does operate in a arena where you've got constant appeals for movement unity from various people and various different levels, and of course it's very, what's wrong with movement unity? It sounds so good, right? But if the effect of movement unity is to close down critique, then that can't be a good thing, because that would then create stagnation that would be destructive. So there's got to be a balance, and people have got to be flexible. And within our flexibility, we could be diplomatic, I suppose. And, maybe that's the key to it. If we were respectful in terms of our discourse and our language, that goes a long way, rather than, I see people getting very angry very quickly. And I often wonder why that is, especially when it's another animal advocate. And suddenly they seem to have no respect for the person. They just want to insult them and call them names. And I wonder why that would be. And also, would they do that in person? And if they wouldn't, then why are they doing it online?
well, if I can drop the P word, I think there's some psychology going on there, because I think we're probably all, I'll put my hands up, I'm constant, you can't dodge it, I already put it out there. I think we're all probably battling with the idea that the movement's not moving fast enough, because we are, in a very, very small speck of a very big movement that could take centuries. And it's difficult to come to terms with that. I know I struggle with that concept on a daily basis. So, and I think we oftentimes lash out at others when we're feeling this frustration. All of a sudden it's their fault that we're not moving faster and fill in the blank.
Also, I think as vegans, we do have a lot of emotion that we have to suppress because of what we're aware of. What the as Claire Mann coins it, dystopia. We're living with this awareness day in and day out, and having to live in a society of pure cultural speciesism, and just being aware of what the other animals are going through all the time, and that lives with you day in and day out. And I think a lot of us are very emotional, and we have a lot of anger.
I mean, I agree with that, Wendy, but it's not just emotion. I think a lot of us are in pain, aren't we?
Yeah, it's pain.
Yeah, a lot of people are really traumatized, and then there's the issue about self-trauma, the idea of watching things and going to save vigils every week and this kind of stuff. So there's a lot in that. I mean, I think it's a really valid and important point you've made there, because it's painful in a way being a vegan, and so I mean that must go to some respect to why some people kind of, as it were, drop out, or I don't know, try and take a back seat or something. They just want to not be in pain, and that is a very human thing.
And especially when I think when we did the poll back in the Zoom calls, the leading thing was that not seeing enough change. I think think we need to be realistic. There's a good chance we'll see very little change in our lifetimes that, you know, we can really quantify as I did this and I had this outcome. Because, yeah. So being realistic about it. But I think we are, I'll put on my optimist hat. I think we are moving in the right direction, but just not trying to look for it, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Now, calm down, Jeremy.
Oh, I'll be a pessimist again. All right. Well, maybe we leave it there. We're at the kind of arbitrary hour mark, and I think we've shared a lot of good thoughts. Let's keep it going in the comments. Do ask that we keep those respectful, and we'll see everyone next week. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Everyone.